The Clay Marble, Chapter 1. I heard a cowbell. At first, it was such a faint, tinkling sound that I thought it was just the wind in the trees or the shrill cry of cicadas. I looked around, dapple shadows stirred under a thick canopy of wild tamarind and rain trees, but there was no sign of life on the narrow trail stretching out ahead of us. I held my breath and kept listening. Yes, there it was again, the clear, quiet tone of a bronze bell. Saroon, listen, I cried. Can you hear it? My older brother turned to look at me. Hear what? He asked. A cowbell. Saroon straightened up beside me in the ox cart and reined in the pair of oxen. Without the crunch of their hooves on the dry leaves, the forest seemed eerily quiet. I don't hear a thing, he said. I don't either, Dara, my mother added. She was sitting in the back of the cart behind us on a thin layer of straw. Well, I heard it, I said. A bronze cowbell. A big one, probably shiny too. I could imagine it gleaming in the afternoon sunlight as it swung from the neck of a strong young bull. Visualize. Which direction was it coming from? Saroon asked. Can you tell? I pointed to the reddish glow of afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees. Visualize. Due west, my brother said thoughtfully, starting the oxen on their way again. That's where we're headed. Maybe we're getting close to the border. That's what you've been saying for days, I snapped, my hunger making me irritable. Saroon glanced over at me and tried to smile. Maybe we'll actually reach it tonight. Then we'll have grilled fish and fresh white rice for dinner. How does that sound? I want something now, I said. But you just had breakfast, my mother broke in gently. There was a bit of straw in her hair, and she looked tired and discouraged. That was just a handful of cold rice, I protested. Besides, Saroon gave me a warning look. Quiet, it said. Don't make Mother any unhappier. I remained silent. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves above and the creaking of cartwheels beneath us. Then my stomach growled. We would have been better off if we had stayed at home, I mumbled. Saroon heard me and looked around. Stayed home? For what? He asked. There's nothing there. No food, no seeds, no animals. I thought of our village. Saroon was right, I admitted silently. It was just an expanse of dried up rice fields now, with a crumbling temple and flimsy huts in the latest spate of fighting. The Khmer Rouge soldiers had even set fire to our houses and rice barns, so that the invading Vietnamese soldiers wouldn't be able to claim them. But that had left us with nothing to eat, no rice seed with which to plant our next crop of rice, not even a house to live in. It had not always been like that, though. I remembered happier times when I was just 2 or 3 years old and the smiling, round-faced Prince Sihanouk ruled Cambodia. Our little village was a peaceful and prosperous place then, the rice fields green and calm, the harvest plentiful. At weddings and on temple feast days, I had sat curled in my mother's warm lap, nibbling at some sticky rice and coconut, sleepily watching the familiar faces of my father and brother, cousins, aunts, and grandparents, dancing by the light of a kerosene lamp in the temple courtyard. But then the fighting and bombing had started. At first, the war had been distant and mysterious. Tiny silver airplanes like fishes in the sky would fly over us before disappearing into the horizon. Then the bombing had come closer, so close that the bombs shook the soil beneath my bare feet. My father and the other farmers in our village dug trenches where we all hid, crouching at the sound of the approaching planes. For months, bombs were dropped around us, sometimes as often as 5 or 6 times a day, and many of the villagers were killed or hurt by shrapnel. Gaunt young communist soldiers dressed in black came down from the hills to tell us that it was the American imperialists who were bombing us. Kill the imperialist, they exhorted us, and kick out Prince Sihanouk. But that was like being told to catch evil spirits. So faceless and far away were the pilots, their airplanes, and the prince in his palace. Yet, remote as they seemed, they must have been defeated because the bombing stopped. Soon the communist soldiers took over the village, announcing that they had liberated us. Liberation turned out to be a long nightmare of hunger and misery and fear, always that cold, silent fear. My brother and most of the other young men in our village were sent miles away to dig ditches with huge work crews. Most of the women and children were allowed to remain at home, but we had to work much harder than before and always under the watchful eyes of the armed soldiers. We never got enough to eat and were sometimes fed only rice gruel and boiled banana stalks at dawn and dusk. One night my father was roused from his sleep and taken away by 2 soldiers. We found his body the next day at the edge of the forest. Had he been killed because he knew how to read and write and had taught the village children their alphabet? Or perhaps because he had gone to catch some snails in the fields for my grandmother to eat because she was sick and dying? I will never know. I knew only that I was not allowed to ask about him or even cry when I missed him. Over and over again, we had been told by the Khmer Rouge soldiers that Cambodia was one big family and that the Communist Party was our parent. And yet, in trying to create a new family, the communists destroyed my own family, ripping apart parent from child, brother from sister, husband from wife. It made no sense to me, since I could not understand how these shrill young soldiers could be my parents, but I did not dare ask. 3 years passed like one long nightmare, the kind where you are gripped by such a cold dread that you are unable to wake up from it. Finally, shortly after I turned 12, Vietnamese soldiers in green uniforms marched into our village, sending Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge soldiers on the run, and liberated us again. In the confusion, while the 2 armies were busy fighting each other, Saroon and some of the other farm boys escaped from their work crew and made their way home. What a strange reunion that was. So muted and sad. Father was dead, Mother told Saroon, and grandmother as well, describing how other relatives had died or disappeared. Mother started to weep, but Saroon stopped her. It's not time to grieve yet, he said. This is our chance to save what's left of our family. The Khmer Rouge butchers are in retreat, and the new Vietnamese control regime doesn't seem to have much power over us yet. We've got to try and put our own lives in order now. And he told us of his plans to cross overland through western Cambodia to the border between our country and Thailand. He had heard rumors of a refugee camp called Nong Chan, located on the Thai-Cambodian border, where free food and tools were being handed out. Thousands of farmers all over Cambodia have made their way there, he told us. That's our hope, to go over there and stock up on food and rice seed and other supplies. Then we can come home, repair the house, replant our fields, start our lives over again. Let's leave it here.